What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and I'm here with the man, the myth, the legend, the Bo Daddy. Yeah! Get pumped, Bo.
Good morning. And I'd like to say good morning to the new Pope who comes from my same backyard of Chicago, IL. And I'm developing a character where the new Pope talks like a super fan, where he says, "Duh, Pope. Hey, the peace of Christ be with you."
Oh,
My
because
first
y'all come together around one football team, but you're divided when it goes to baseball.
my
And
first
apparently, he's
order
a White Sox fan.
my first order of business will be recommending for sainthood Coach Dicka.
Did you see that when he was a senior in undergrad, he had Jack Caputo for for
fact-
existentialism?
The fact that the new Pope has studied with one of the JCs is absolutely astounding.
Well, now you studied with a JC and you're the vicar of JC, so
Oh,
it all works out. Did you just, someone needs to make a little meme with like the Pope walking out on there, except like the book he's reading from is actually What Would Jesus Deconstruct?
oh my gosh.
Which is
That'd be
Caputo,
hilarious.
Derrida student who taught the Pope, but like about how the kingdom of God is auto-deconstructive and that the church was like the fallback plan when things didn't work out. And there's like the Pope coming out there and
It would also be funny if the new Pope like misquoted people. Have you ever seen this meme? It comes from Sarah Silverman, the comedian, and I don't know if she was under an influence of a substance or something, but she misquotes people all the time. Have you seen then people make it into a meme? So like, for instance, she'll be like, it's like Jesus said, and then she doesn't know what Jesus said exactly, and she'll be like, and this is the meme, like, F around and find out. And people are like, Jesus never said that. So they make it into the funniest things, and then it morphed and it became like misquoting Yoda, and then using the way that his sentence construction works to say things he would never say. It's one of my favorite memes.
Do they take the misquotes of her, put it in Yoda speak, and then give it to Yoda?
Yes. It's wonderful. But I would love it if the new Pope did it, if he's like, it's like my favorite professor in college, Jack Caputo, says, "Go F yourself." You're like, I don't think Dr. Jack said that.
At least not in class. No, it's hilarious. The anyone with Chicago connections.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder what the church attendance is going to be Sunday in Chicago. They're just going to be like, well, if we get in good with this guy, then maybe the Bears offensive line is going to.
Literally, the first thing that I thought of when I heard that the new Pope was from Chicago is, I wonder if if it will bump up the Bears' prospects for winning the Super Bowl.
All of a sudden, very large, strong athletes from around the world that never played football are like, we want to be the O-line in Chicago because we're devout Catholics.
Yeah. Can we on a serious
go to the
note,
Super Bowl?
What?
If you're an American Pope, then I feel like you should get the halftime interview at the Super Bowl. That's your outreach. Like when you go back to your home country, Pope Francis comes back because and instead of the president, it's the Pope, and except he mostly is just complaining that the Bears aren't in it, and they're like, well, we have all these things going on. He's like, no, I know, I pray about that stuff every day right after I pray for the Chicago Bears.
On a slightly more serious note, as excited as I am about the Chicago connection, I am a little worried if I view this through a post-colonial lens. When so many cardinals from around the world, and specifically the Southern Hemisphere and the global South, were up. The fact that an American is the new pope is very strange during this period of, imperialism.
I do think it's a little different in the fact that he hadn't been in America forever, been in Peru, is a dual citizen. Like, he chose to become Peruvian, but was born from Chicago.
Yeah.
And that move is something you could imagine, right? Them wanting to say, like, this is what the church should do. Like, the church was the religious frontier of early colonialism into the New World, all this kind of stuff. We want the church to do what Leo did, like become, choose the global South as their home and identity, maybe something like that. That's my optimistic take on it there, Bo. But
all right, here's my optimistic take, and this is a theology nerd. If people have not read The Weakness of God, which is an absolutely incredible book, but if you read What Would Jesus Deconstruct, he summarizes the weakness of God, I think in chapter 3 or 4. And it's an incredible summary. So even if you're not going to read the entire Weakness of God, which is
a John Caputo book.
Sorry, yeah, John Caputo. But definitely get What Would Jesus Deconstruct, because he summarizes the weakness of God in a very good way.
Yeah. So, but, it could have been a lot worse. This is what goes through my head. Is, anything after Francis, you're like, oh, where's this going to go? Are we going to get the overreaction?
Yeah.
And get, at least it's someone who's.
Yeah. There was real worry about like a conservative corrective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's funny, though, as non-Catholics, don't you think it's funny as non-Catholics that we're so invested, just because the Catholic Church, and specifically in Africa and South America and Asia, it is vibrant right now. And even though its American expression may not be what it once was, we're still invested in this because of the influence, that the Catholic Church has, even for us as non-Catholics.
Yeah. And if he becomes the most popular American, then it's good for our PR, because currently the president's the most well-known American. So,
hey, Jasmine wants to know, suppose the Holy Ghost had drafted either of you to be Pope, what name would you have picked?
Oh, God.
I would go with Facetious. Is that a saint? Saint Facetious?
It can be. I mean, I don't think you get told no. I think that's one of the. I think the third pope was Cletus.
Oh,
so there was Peter, then Linus, and then Cletus. And when I learned that first time in church history, I was like, I don't know a Catholic named Cletus. I only know people in Trailer Park.
Right.
So, what if you were like Cletus Deuce? Like, you don't go the second. Deuce Cletus.
You don't think that the Pope has to pass his new name by a committee? It doesn't have to be approved?
Are you saying that, like, if he had come out and been like, I'm Skibbity Toilet the first, I'm trying to connect with the youth?
Oh, man.
I don't know. I've just watched the movie Conclave. I didn't see any debate about the name. But they do all ask each other what name you would pick.
Oh, right? Really?
Yeah. So they discuss. It's like a thing. You're like hanging out. You're all kind of vying for it or trying to avoid the position, but then you don't want to get caught really doing it. But then there's like, what would your name be? Also kind of signals what you're going for. And so picking where Leo, the previous Leo, kicks off Catholic social teaching, the first big critique of the economic order, moving into, saw his role as moving the church into the modern world rather explicitly, to like pick the name of the guy that's like Rerum Novarum, which is, the big encyclical for the last Leo. Pretty cool. One of the early Leos is the one who went out and met with Attila the Hun to talk him down from slaughter. So he could be like, down for critiquing the market and eliminating war.
Wow.
Seems basic Jesus things.
Tripp, I'm slightly distracted. I know a lot of people listen to this later on the podcast stream, but for those who are watching on the live recording, your visual is fascinating today. So you are in your ice fishing tent.
No, I'm just on the porch.
Okay, but you're in the shade, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and you're wearing
I have a tent, but it's not the ice fishing tent. That's closed. That's for when it's cold, Bo.
Oh, just when it's cold. So then you're in orange, and I think you might have a Baltimore Orioles cap or something similar.
Yeah.
And then, but the sun is out behind you, and it's lush and green. You really do look like you're inside around the embers of a fire. Oh, there's the fire. Okay. It's holy smoke.
Ooh, yeah. I know, but that name was already taken.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that you had done a holy smoke one time.
I did, but I didn't claim the Instagram account and stuff. Because I'm not trying to find ways to be on the internet. I just like talking.
I got to go golfing yesterday, and we're coming down the 9th hole, and then going the other way is some other hole, and I can smell cigar smoke. But cigars always smell good if you're not trapped in a room with them. So outdoors, they smell really nice. But a lot of them sort of generically smell the same, but this one had a particular something about it. And so I left my bag and everything, and I walked over and asked the guy what he was smoking, and I'm pretty sure it was one of the cigars that my dad used to smoke. It smelled incredible, and it just brought back so many memories. Smell is an incredible trigger of access to your memories. It's wild. You can smell something and remember where you were the last time you smelled that.
Yeah. Oh, I had a friend, a longtime friend, who's wore sandals all the time, and he has his own brand of sandal funk.
Oh, geez.
And there was a guy in Scotland, one of the students, who, when it got warm, wore sandals, and he had the same sandal funk smell. I'd never smelled it before. And, we're in a different country and everything. And then you're just like, oh, God, what? And then I was like, oh, my friend.
Oh, man. What does it smell like? Moldy yogurt? Or
yeah, but whatever the microbiome of that foot, they got some yogurt strand in
Oh, my.
I don't know, but it was, yeah.
Oh, my.
And what's odd is my nose tickles just telling you that story. It's like, ooh. So,
hey, Tripp, I've been doing a little research on liberalism since our last episode. And it's been really fascinating, actually, to dig into that at the same time that the search for the new pope has been in the news. And I just wanted to throw this out. We don't have to go anywhere with it, but Catholics have a different metaphysic, right? And this is in all due respect, and as a non-Catholic, I apologize if I get any of this wrong, because anytime you're talking about a group you don't belong to, you're painting with a pretty broad brush. And so I know to be
also sweeping critical generalizations of Catholic is part of your Protestant heritage, right?
Well, that's one of the things, by the way, I appreciate about being Methodist is that we come from the Anglo-Catholic DNA of the Church of England. And so we have that non-Protestant middle way sort of, value.
Yeah, you're wusses.
What's that?
You're just wussy.
Well, we call it that we prioritize the connection, and we spell it with an X because it's British.
Oh. You have a more even temperament.
So we're not part of, that same radical Protestant Reformation, the radical Reformation. But yes, And growing up evangelical, we had a very strong anti-Catholic bias that I've had to work on over the last 20 years. But anyway, all of that is to say, it has been interesting studying liberalism, specifically in the 19th and 20th century. At the same time, because it prioritizes, like, for instance, it validates science, and then in updates, theological conviction and sources of revelation based on that. But the Catholics, they still have what you might call like a medieval metaphysic, right? I mean, their doctrine of transubstantiation, the ordination of priests, even their view of marriage, the sacrament of marriage, they're really working off a very old metaphysic and struggling a little bit, because they don't have a mechanism to update like liberal Protestantism does. It's just been a very interesting contrast that I wanted to just throw out there.
Yeah, because the Protestants were their protest was against a tradition where its institutional authority and interpretive authority had all these kind of like layers on it, right? So there's like the decision for the canons, you get decisions for the creeds and the interpretation of it, and then it kept expanding over time on the rules of like with following the internal rules of the Catholic tradition. It has, you might have gone off path in all sorts of ways, and it self-corrects over time and all that kind of stuff. But the Protestant protest, right, like the going to the root of going to the gospel, right, like where Luther's like the gospel precedes the canon. We didn't write anything down. The resurrection happened first, right? The gospel happens, and all this other stuff comes after it. So our fidelity is to the gospel, and if that's the case, then we can call into question faithfully all this other stuff. And that's just not how the discernment process for the Catholic Church goes. And one of the ways you can see that in there is that, its metaphysical system is one, it's a very organic account, right? Like it's using Aristotle and Aquinas.
Yeah.
The essence of something is something that comes into being through its flourishing and development, right? From like seed to tree. And so if you're seeing the natural world that way, if you see the tradition is like the flowering of what came in, then these threads of continuity that really make you more conservative, because you're conserving, right, the attachment to the origin of something, to its development. Then you have like a very that worldview in a sense sets up for something much more conservative than the Protestant one. It's just the Protestant one started, and then like the next week there's 40 different kinds of biblical Christians. And then we still invent new ones, and you can see the Protestantism like invading Catholicism when like rando lay people tell the Pope how to be Catholic. You saw the new Pope was trolling JD Vance on Twitter before he was just like, JD Vance is wrong. Could you imagine Pope Francis calls you out, you go to see him, he dies the next day, and then the new Pope's the one that had been trolling you on Twitter, and you've only been a Catholic for a few years, and he's like, just like Augustine says. Now the new Augustinian Pope, JD Vance, you're wrong. So like one perk of the conservative streak is like you don't get to like go like, nah, I've changed my mind, I can tell you what it's really like to be a Catholic. And you're like, no. See, Martin Luther tried that. We got if he wanted to be the true Baptist, in all likelihood, the one true biblical Baptist hadn't even been born yet, because every generation we come up with new ways. The other ones are wrong, and we finally got it figured out.
I grew up non-sacramental evangelical, and I truly was repulsed by the idea of transubstantiation. I just hated the Eucharistic, right, understanding.
What about it? You mean like you had this kind of like water to wine in John? This is literally turning into flesh.
Yeah. So when you're a biblical literalist, that literalism can transport into every area of your life.
It can backfire.
I mean, it's one of the reasons I didn't like reading fiction. I called it faction, was because I was like too much of a literalist. Tripp, in the words of Peter Rollins, I overbelieved. Right? Like eschatology, I really overbelieved. So when it came to things like sacrament, we used it was symbol, it was ritual, it was right poetic symbolism, and so I just did not like Eucharistic understanding of transubstantiation. But here's something interesting that happened to me. I was pastoring in the Northeast. I was in Saratoga Springs, New York, which is right by Vermont. And so there's a heavy Catholic community in the Northeast, in New England. And when the sex abuse scandal, the clergy sex abuse scandal, was just making its way into the news and was just coming to light in a way that, horrified everybody, one of the things that happened is that I learned that, the Catholic, the metaphysic that we're talking about, it's why you can't just defrock priests, because when they are made priests, the belief is that they're actually at the cellular level, right? That ontologically they change. And so you can't just undo that with the stroke of a pen, right? And even through the tragedy and the horror of the sex abuse scandal, I actually came to understand the Catholic metaphysic a little better. And then I was like, I appreciated actually the consistency of transubstantiation. Like, oh, so like when we do a wedding and we say the two are now one, right? In that declaration, in that utterance, that ontologically, these two are joined in a way they previously weren't. It's not symbolic. It's not poetic. It's not ritual in just the word sense, right? It's not a linguistic thing. That it's actually something transforms at the cellular level and in the heavenlies, right? That in the cosmic sense that these two are now joined for eternity. And so like it's the consistency that I grew to respect. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, me growing up, I basically thought religious diversity was the kind of Baptist you were. I remember meeting my first Methodist and wondering, like, is this a cult? Is this a what is this in? And just because I'd never met one before, I'm like bringing it up to my parents, like, what? No, and then I think that's why they're like, it's time to move to a city.
Here's a new
witness to Methodists.
Well, they wouldn't know what you were doing, but yeah.
They're like, what do you mean? Well, you got Catholic baptism. We're talking about Christian. You have to be able to walk.
Here's a new interesting wrinkle in Southern Idaho. In our Bible study, we've picked up a couple of people who were raised Jehovah's Witness. And because we live in an area where about 25-30% of the population is LDS, Latter-day Saints, there's a sort of an ecumenical sort of tolerance, appreciation, even sometimes partnership between mainline churches. So not the conservative or fundamentalist or evangelical churches, but more of us mainline with LDS folks. And, ever since Mitt Romney ran for president, we have declassified them as a cult, right? We no longer call Mormon Church cult. But one of the interesting things is that people who are former JWs, they were former Jehovah's Witnesses, they think that JW is a cult. And so it is a very strange dynamic, because once people are X something, they have like a zeal of a convert, right? Like they have strong opinions, like
Definitely.
evangelicals. What?
Definitely.
Yeah. And so ex-JWs say things about their former group that I'm used to when I lived in a non-LDS community, people saying about Mormons. And it is really like every time it comes up, like I can feel instantly like my anxiety rises and I get really like uncomfortable because they're stating things so confidently. And I'm like, I don't know if we want to go down this road.
Uh-huh. That's funny.
So
When you moved to LA,
yeah.
I had the experience of, being on like the activist interfaith thing and, for
Yeah.
the area. And then you have Scientologists.
Oh.
And those conversations, if you were at the right table with, clergy from all these different traditions, the hardest thing for the more conservative of any religious tradition is taking the Scientologists seriously whatsoever. Like, so you could have Mormon, Catholic, Unitarian, Swedenborgian, all of them sitting there, Muslim, Jews, everybody. But like, they almost all are like, and at first I was like, isn't it a little uncomfortable? Like, I mean, I have my own judgments over all sorts of things, but I realized they actually were doing it for very specific pastoral reasons where someone in a family connected to them got like sucked in. There's this whole, like the impact of that community on other family members in their thing. And then I was like, okay, that makes a lot more sense than just being like, no, I think it's completely reasonable to have an executed but raised homeless Jew from Second Temple period. That's reasonable, but yours, that's the wild one. But it's the ethics of the institution. And one of the priests, Catholic priests, was just like, was the one that said, well, some of us have mourned and worked against the protection of mourned and worked against like the ongoing protection of child abuse in our tradition, and we don't think that falsifies it. And it was at the highest levels being protected, and in the area. So it was something. I was just like, but could I ask you some questions, like about off the internet, about like what happens when you get to a certain level? Have you seen the HBO doc?
Oh my gosh. Hey, good morning. Bruce Epperly is in the chat.
Watch out.
Whoa. He said he has maybe a new book, Saving Progressive Christianity to Save the Planet. Oh, a process theology and the revival we need. Oh my gosh.
Bruce is a publishing fiend. It's like the moment his administrative duties decline, and then he's just like, let me write some books. I feel like there are these levels, like your ability to write more goes up when all your kids can wipe. Like there's that, and then like once none of them want your attention, like it's a chore for them to give you attention, then they leave home. And then there's like your vocational day-to-day duties start to drop. And so I just have like Google Doc upon Google Doc of things I want to write if I ever get as good at it as Bruce, because he just
if it weren't for Bruce Epperly in the 2009 interview he did with you on Homebrewed Christianity, I'm not sure I would have ever even been open to process, but he made it so accessible and so relevant. And I'll never forget during that interview, at one point he asked you about if you thought your pets had experience. And you and him talked about how you told a story about how you had a dog who figured out if they like asked to go outside, they didn't pee or poop, and then they came back in, they would still get a treat. And that kind of problem solving and creativity. And then Bruce did a theological reflection on it that was so inspiring and novel to me that I actually like opened my heart a little bit to say like, all right, I'll give this a chance.
Oh, look at
Yeah.
the lure coming that way. Okay, so I'm interested after last week. What's been going through your head when we were when apparently discussing all the problems liberal Christianity faces ends up occupying 2 hours?
I have been troubled in my spirit
Oh,
that we were so pessimistic. And
I got messages about it.
Did you really?
Yeah, like multiple people want, and John Augustine, who's in the chat, sent me a message.
Yeah.
And he's a former student, hopefully taking one more class with me. And I was like, oh no, I'm making my students depressed too. This is bad news.
Oh no. Well, so what I did is I said in my heart, I said that I thought maybe on the next episode I'll play one of my characters and I'll stick up for the future of liberal Christianity.
Oh, what's the name of this character, Bo?
Oh, I haven't. All right, I haven't fleshed it out enough
character
yet.
if you're doing this, or did you already talk yourself out of it?
I'm going to try. I'll work on it. Hold on, I'll work on it. But what happened, Tripp, is that my week around here kept reinforcing how much trouble we're in. And then as I listened to various podcasts, either theological or political, about the trouble that contemporary liberalism in general and maybe liberal theology finds itself in, I wondered if we were destined to be a minority report. Because the thing I keep coming back to is, while we're right, and we're sure that we're right, or as confident as you can be, we're suspicious.
Suspicious.
That should be my saint name, Saint Suspicious. I'll tell you that. We're suspicious that we're right. What we end up presenting, right? So it's one thing to have conviction. It's another thing to have expression. But because of that liberal laryngitis that we talked about, it is difficult to present a compelling vision because we are absent that same sense of certainty that our fundamentalist sisters and brothers get to have. We have so much of that throat clearing, as Tony Jones talks about, before we ever get to write what we want to say. There's so much introductory material that I just don't know that as it currently is comprised, that there's much reason for hope, except that I'm pretty sure we're right.
All right.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not adding any new datum. I'm just saying. I think we're right now. Underneath that, right, though, I think is right, like that tension is a great articulation of the kind of cultural mismatch of the moment. Where so if one of the major shifts, and this is something I've been thinking about since last week,
all right,
religion in its earliest moments, emerges because of it emerges before beliefs are involved whatsoever, right? Like if the emergence of religion with Homo sapiens and this kind of thing, and it's playing these binding roles. It's how we end up cooperating. We develop kind of symbolic communication, social knowledge, all these kinds of things that are there. But it's not until really the axial period, you get these kind of moral high gods, and then you get beliefs about those gods, all these ways in which kind of intensify the bonding of a community for social cooperation, where these would be like the evolutionary mechanisms that get you selected for. But there's this birth of belief is being central to modern religion, right? So what distinguishes religious traditions when we talk about them is what they believe, and we're focused on these beliefs, and yet beliefs are kind of strapped on top of kind of the religious form of life, its enactment, uh, the experiential dimension, and this kind of thing. And when you think of the age of belief, what is the tradition that took that task so seriously it opens itself up critically to all sorts of things? It's the liberal tradition. Now, that in many ways, it functioned better when the church, in a culture of belief and one of critical thinking, like the kind of modern moment, that the church had cultural status and standing, where for large periods of mainline Protestantism, there are plenty of towns, the most educated person there is the clergy, right? So when the authority of the church and institutionally declines, when its intellectual authority dissipates and stuff, to then be the tradition of critical, faithful belief, that kind of cultural mismatch changes. And yet, from the birth of the liberal tradition on, there also is this affective dimension, right? Like the feeling of absolute dependence in Schleiermacher is one example, but like that element shifts throughout. That, like, in some sense, the liberal tradition's always been different forms of kind of romanticism or idealism, like philosophically, and so the more the two different big pathways of liberal theology, the one that took Kant as normative, is ends up running aground intellectually because of cultural shifts, not intellectual shifts. So anyway, I thinking about that and then going, okay, but we are at this moment, and this is something Christian Smith talks about in his work. You could see it, Hartmut Rosa's book on resonance, the kind of growth. Christian Smith calls it a new desire for re-enchantment existing culturally, right?
Okay.
So institutional religious decline is there, but if you look at survey data in the long form interviews and stuff he does with people that have disengaged and things, this is also true in a lot of the research on the nuns. It's not as if the problem, the belief-centered institutions that are being disengaged, it's not as if that leads into this secular utopia or reductive thinking. It means there's very much bricolage approaches. There's exploration of past wisdom traditions, or like pagan Wicca practices, New Age, New Thought stuff. All these kinds of things are emerging, where the people who have disengaged will have higher or similar affirmations of mystical religious experience, of having personal rituals, and all these kinds of things. And so one of the possibilities, right, in thinking about future of liberal Christianity is, what is it like to engage a culture's desire for re-enchantment, and how do you hand the tradition off, starting in a more experientially grounded place with the wisdom of a tradition, rather than gatekeeping it with intellectual affirmations or belief, focused primarily on belief. The leaders of the community obviously would have the belief shape the way you interact and experience and embody and practice the tradition. But where is it met? That kind of desire for re-enchantment, I think, is a real fertile place in culture to take a kind of confident yet humble articulation of a more liberal Christianity.
Interesting. The other thing that I've been thinking about that I wanted to mention is, when I was doing my qualifying exams in my field of practical theology, every time I bring up my my qualls, you laugh because
I know stories.
there's so many funny stories, but I know what story you're thinking of. Well, in my field of practical theology, one of the sort of Renaissance moments was in the early 80s, 1981. The book ended up coming out in 1983. The Renaissance in Practical Theology. There was a conference hosted at the Chicago. I think it's Theological Seminary. Anyway, but folks like David Tracy and specifically Don Browning, they were employing a correspondence theory that said that our practical experience, what's actually happening in the world, right? And for us in the scientific age, and that data needed to correspond to our theological convictions and practice. And so it was a dialogue between the two. So that approach is, like, for me, it's vital. And that's where I find my home in my spirituality and my theological conviction. But I'm very aware that not everybody is okay or comfortable with that approach. And the critics of that school of thought, you know, have a pretty vicious critique of it. So that's the other thing I've been thinking about all week is, like, this reclamation project, if you want to call it that, or reenchantment, or second naivete, if you go with Ricoeur. But for me, in my field, you know, for Don Browning, and specifically in conversation with David Tracy and others, Schubert Ogden, and there's just an open-mindedness and a willingness to revisit the doctrines and convictions and practices of the past in a way that updates them and corresponds to our lived reality in the contemporary moment. And that's something that, like, I'm committed to for the rest of my life. But I have been reflecting on why some folks are not down with that program.
Yeah. Yeah. And mentioning David there, David Tracy passed away this past week.
Stop.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
His book, Blessed Rage, is Blessed Rage for Order. And then The Analogical Imagination. Those are the two books where he kind of develops his theology of correlation. In one of the, which is, right, like, he's picking up Paul Tillich's theology of correlation. And they're, you know, that task of correlating the Christian tradition in the modern situation in a way where it's mutually illuminating and mutually critical. And so, like, if you take that form of theology, the reciprocity of illumination and criticism are there. You know, like, so for Tillich, and this is something David Tracy picks up, it's not just that culture asks the question, and the theologians trying to exegete culture to understand these questions of existential significance or religious significance. And then it's like, how does the tradition speak into this? You know, in many ways, that's like an apologetic move, right? How do you articulate it to it? And one of the theologians' tasks is actually listening intensely to culture in its artifacts, art, all these kinds of things. In the last 2 years, I've used film, like in doing theological exegesis of film, as a way of, like, practicing this kind of dynamic. But you listen there, but there's but David Tracy was emphasizing something Tillich didn't always do, that it goes in reverse as well. Right. And so if the question coming from the culture sets up an apologetic task, when sometimes the questions come from the tradition and it sets up a prophetic task.
Yeah.
Right. So and that's why I think there's a I think that's one of the reasons it's really helpful. It's also practical, right? Because then the principal sources for theology are both like common human experience and language, and then how does it get expressed and all those kinds of things in culture. And then he uses the language. It's like the experience and the facts, texts, symbols, stories, rituals of the Christian tradition. And the task of the theologian is to set them in critical correlation. But Tracy has this line. We'll see. I don't know if it's exactly like this, but it's something where he says, like, there's a dialogical balance between the demands of the tradition and the questions posed by our world. And that dialectical tension that exists there is the work of theology.
Yeah.
Right. And what's fascinating is how some of his peers are like, especially more traditional ones, like, no, we're doing theology. Then we tell the world what its conclusions are. And so the moment you describe your task that way, then the theologian's greatest tool is listening, right? Both to the tradition itself, right? Because you're listening to it at the same time you're listening to the world.
Yeah.
And then you're correlating, right? Like you're kind of bringing to light the reality of our experience, world, and challenges, and the tradition in ways they kind of, it's like holding two prisms and shifting them so that the light hits. Some people hear that and they're like, oh, hell yeah. And then others are like, but I wanted to hold something tightly that was the answer. And then David Tracy's like, nah, it's called idolatry. Why would you want to do that?
Tripp, this is my favorite theology nerd topic we've ever covered. Like I am buzzing right now. My heart is alive. The synapses in my brain are firing. My data of books that I've read, lectures that I've listened to, articles and journals. I love this conversation so much because the analogy that introduced me to it that I keep returning to is that in this approach, this dialogical approach of correlation, the world asks the church questions, but the church has to translate its answers into ways that the world can hear. And then the church asks the world questions, but the church also, or the theologian, also has to translate what the world says, how it responds, because that is the task of the theologian. The onus cannot be on the world to respond in theological terms, right? Because the very nature of the world is that that's not how it speaks. That's not how it understands. That's not what it values. And so this dialogue between the theologian and culture, the theologians ask the culture questions, culture responds, but culture also asks theologians questions. But that is the task and the beauty for me of the theological enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm here for it, man. I'm committed my whole life to this. I went into student debt in my doctoral program to be a part of this program. And it's what I do in my pastoral office. It makes me come alive. I want to wake up in the morning, and it's what I'm thinking about when I go to bed. This is my existence. It flows out of my being. And I just love, we didn't even plan on talking about this. This just sort of organically came up, but it excites me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can say also in a negative, in a way that every other task I am assigned, whether it is conference committees or worship planning, in the programming meetings and everything else I have to do, if it weren't for this, I would have less than zero interest in doing all that other stuff.
Yeah.
I have no interest in reading the patristics outside of this dialogical lens.
I don't know. Some of it's just pretty.
And I know other people get really into it, right? And some people are into mystical, like the history of mystical experience and theology. And there's so many interesting things about church history and theology and practice And I have zero interest in it outside of this dialogical approach.
Yeah.
That's my confession.
It reminds me of that William Ernst Hocking has this line where he said that no religion is a true religion that does not make one tingle to their fingertips with a sense of infinite hazard. That tingling with infinite hazard, like both of like the seriousness of one's own life, the lives of the tradition, the moment you're in, all those kinds of things. But like it is a dangerous activity. Walking out your front door.
It's one of the reasons I miss my father so much is, you know, his degrees were in church history. And so as I'm doing this cultural exegesis, I was able to call him and talk with him on the phone. And then he would bring me up to speed on historical perspectives and things that, you know, he was passionate about, but that aren't my primary concern. And I miss having conversations and having access to him so much, man.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So you mentioned record and something popped up and it connects to one of the kind of potential responses I came up with. So I'll tell it to you. Then you can say whatever. Then I didn't think about connecting record here before, but then I want to try it on you because I know you like some Paul Ricoeur.
I love Paul Ricoeur.
So I mentioned like that one was like engage the desire for reenchantment. Another one is reclaiming myth. And this Wyman, who I mentioned last week, has this bit where he says, hold on, let me pull up the quote. Liberal theology needs to rethink its prejudice against myth and recognize that myth is a vehicle of God's word. Instead of abandoning myth to conservatives, liberals should bring the art and literature of an informed imagination, the philosophic acumen of a liberated mind, and the ethically awakened conscience into service of extending this Christian criticism of man's life into the whole of culture. You know, and he's there kind of observing this sense that when liberal Christianity has not just sought to engage a modern world and all these kinds of things, but take its kind of unexamined metaphysical commitments as these a prioris, then you're off just like chucking things out. You're like, well, myth, silly, no basket. And he's like, no, like a more liberal thing to do is just to take how seriously, like, you know, Dom Crossan used the line in one of the classes recently. He's like, metaphors make reality. So like if you're like, oh, it's just a myth or it's just a metaphor, these kinds of things, similar thing that Paul Ricoeur does, like no, language is how we build the world. Like you may think the way you were handed language, where you were born and you internalize the language of whatever culture you're in.
Yeah.
But by the time you learn to talk, your experience and interpretation of reality has already internalized whatever power, vision was in the language you were handed, right? And so when you're handed a tradition that speaks in myth, then the question isn't like to sit there and be like, well, this happened historically or this didn't. If you stop there, you're just enacting the same prejudice against myth for a culture that then has to go reinvent its own, right? And well, we don't need to go into sides of the mythology that's internalized in our current world, but then when he has that kind of like 3-part task of bring the art and literature of an informed imagination, the philosophic acumen of a liberated mind, right? Like this is a very Protestant thing to do. And then an ethically awakened conscience into the service of extending Christian criticism of man's life into the whole culture. And that criticism element, right? Like is the, no, you're not there to baptize the culture. You're actually to call us who are members of it to account before the truth that gets expressed and encountered in, you know, myth as a vehicle for God's word. And I think that a lot of mainline Christians see the difference between them and evangelicals as like, we don't have to believe the stupid stuff, as opposed to we don't have an excuse not to take the real stuff more seriously. And
that was a really interesting. Yeah, I find myself and my community in so much of what you said. Let me throw you a little bit of a curveball, and you tell me what you think of it.
Okay.
So philosophically, I am committed. My commitment is called Constructivism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a social constructivist. That is my philosophical commitment. And so as I'm introducing it to people, I'll say like state lines, like the line between Oregon and California doesn't exist ontologically, right? It's socially constructed.
Just like the one between America and Canada. Like, it's just this beautiful straight line. Why?
Yeah, but you know what's interesting? The majority of Canadians live below that line. If you look at it on the map and population basis, the majority of Americans live below that parallel. It's socially constructed, right? I talk about money, like our cooperation and agreement to utilize money is representative. It's socially constructed. The dollar bill doesn't actually have much value, right? Its value is constructed by people participating in it. That's why race gets called a social construction, is because biologically there's no evidence for it. It's only as people participate in it that it's socially constructed, right? I'm arguing that democracy is socially constructed, but people who are really into democracy actually think that it's a divine revelation, that it comes down from above, right? and it is not socially constructed from the ground up in an emergent expression. I also believe that religion is socially constructed. And my more conservative friends and family don't agree. They think that revelation is a gift from above, right? In the same way that the Constitution is infallible, right, and inerrant, that the founding fathers, right? So I'm saying that it's all socially constructed. Other people think that things like religion or democracy or boundary state lines, right, international borders, that they're real. They're actually real. Okay. So the other night, I'm staining. We had a new kitchen table and it came raw wood and I'm staining it. And hi, Greg Parker. And I'm out in my garage, Tripp, putting the second coat of polyurethane on this table. And I'm listening to you and Paul Capets on liberal Christology. And he's telling a story about preaching the gospel, and specifically a story about Jesus that has a miracle in it. And he has this insightful thing that he talks about, which is in that moment, he's not trying to argue for its historicity or its physical viability. He takes it as, I'm going to say, I don't think he says myth, but this is the power of the myth. He takes it as word and presents it to say, why would Jesus's followers have thought it was important enough to write this down and pass it on to us? What is it calling out of us? And that's a hermeneutical move that has a lot of vibrancy in it, right? That's a potent way to approach that. And I'll admit, I didn't get to listen to the whole interview because I think the fumes from the polyurethane got to me, and Paul Capet started making too much sense.
Oh,
so I had to turn the
in your head
off.
Oh, well, yeah, I love Paul. The Paul Capets and Paul Ricoeur. There's Paul Ricoeur wrote that kind of famous article on the Masters of Suspicion.
Yeah.
And the essay that came after that, when he was giving these lectures, was one that was primarily engaging Bultmann, and talking about the need to have both a hermeneutics of suspicion and a hermeneutics of understanding. And the task of the hermeneutics of understanding is learning to listen to the symbols. And in it, when he's talking about a text, he says, you know, he has the language of like a text has a surplus of meaning.
Yeah.
And that any good text have there are layers of meaning, and often we actually hide ourselves from the true meaning, right? And this is something he picks up in the Masters of Suspicion thing with Freud, right? Like that there are layers of meaning, and we end up hiding ourselves from its true meaning. So what the task of reading, right, hermeneutics of understanding, is actually to expose ourselves to the meanings in a text that we're resisting, right? Because those are the ones that are going to open you up, right, to create a spaciousness of your grasp of the world, for, you know, theologically, right, the divine to occupy. And in that essay, he talks about the intentional fallacy and the fallacy of a absolute text. And the intentional fallacy is where only the author's intention matters for interpretation, right? And so you're like trying to pin down it, like, what's the intentional fallacy, where the only thing is like, what did they mean? What did the author mean? Or there's this other tendency where you do the fallacy of an absolute text, where you kind of like do a hypostatic maneuver where the text is now an authorless entity, and speaks in the voice of God, right? But then you're going to seize it and you're going to miss these hidden layers. And so he talks about having a semantic autonomy of the text, where the author's intentions are absorbed into the text surplus of meaning, but there's always more going on there. And in a religious context, what's being absorbed, right, is both the orientation towards the text as word, right? So like the divine meaning is absorbed into it, but also the author's historical context and all these things are absorbed. But so much more is going on. And he says that the interpreter, hermeneutics of understanding, you have 3 different tasks. Have you ever heard this, where he does this like 3 tasks?
I don't think so.
All right, I'll tell them to you, then you tell me what you think. So one task is you have to be a hermeneut. You're born into symbolic systems within one's culture, your selfhood. Like the task of becoming a self requires exegesis of these stories, be it our family story, our nation story, you know, like we do that. Like you are a hermeneut. And ultimately you have to incorporate and appropriate all these stories for one's own task of self-understanding, right? So you have there's this hermeneutical task. It's just part of being human. So then to doing it with not just suspicion, but understanding is taking responsibility for that task. Another one says when reading, especially a text as sacred, you have to be a phenomenologist. You have to bracket the reality claim of a given text or tradition in order to tend to its lived possibilities, right? So like, you know, phenomenologist, let's bracket something, the epoche, and then like, oh, well, you can guess what's on the other side of this lighter because you know what is probably symmetrical. It might be a little logo on the other side or whatever, and you're filling in everything with the world as you understand it into all these gaps. Well, let's bracket that and then go, well, what are the actual lived possibilities if the text confronts us and we don't fill in what we call normal into all the space? Think of, you know, Jesus saying, you know, whose name and whose image is on the coin, and they don't say Caesar, son of God. And then he says, render to God what's God's and Caesar's what's Caesar's, right? And but if we just start to fill in post-Jeffersonian democracy or whatever, you're like, separation of church and state, pay your taxes. Does it mean? But there are lots of places like that. And then he goes, and at that point, then you also become a theological thinker, allowing oneself to be appropriated by the figurative possibilities imagined by the mythopoetic text and narratives. And it's in that the letting oneself be appropriated by, right, that you become a full self within within the given tradition and things. And so I find that helpful because for him, like philosophy in a sense functions as a means for reflective analysis, and theology proper is like the living testimony to what having been seized by this kind of understanding, this hermeneutics of understanding and such. And so it's it turns religion into a kind of generative impulse and not a determining ground. And I just, anyway, that
what was the third task called?
Being a theological thinker.
Okay.
So you're a hermeneut, you're a phenomenologist, and then you're a theological thinker. And when I introduced Ricoeur in philosophy of religion classes, then after that, I sometimes ask when we're reading religious thinkers, like, oh, which of the tasks that Ricoeur said are they missing, or like how are they performing these tasks, right? And it becomes like a helpful way of reading a theological thinker, but not reading them. Do I believe this or not believe this, or is this a good argument for what I believe, or pushing back? And it makes me think, but watching how they think, so like reading them to understand.
Wow, that's actually really helpful. It's actually a very similar move to the thing I do with the messianic, the poet, the prophetic, and the therapeutic. And to say, instead of which one are they, to say in which voice are they speaking, right? That's a really generous way of reading that. And instead of agree and disagree as categories, to say, in what role are they operating, and what task are they, right, and what's missing. So that's the really helpful aspect of a rubric, an interpretive rubric like that, is and what's missing. So if somebody is doing a hermeneutic, right, and they're reading a text, either an ancient text or a cultural text, but they're not doing the phenomenological of bracketing out and analyzing in that way, and then they skip right to theologizing off of their interpretation, that would be a very different outcome. Or if somebody is really good, right, maybe at doing the hermeneutic of understanding, and then in the phenomenological role, but then they don't theologize out of that, right, then those would be two very different engagements with the same text. So
yeah, and I think that's why he calls he spends a lot of time talking about the religious wager. And it, in a sense, the religious wager is like when one's destiny, you discover it by taking the risk of being assimilated into the world picture of a tradition, where faith is a wager. But when it's a wager, it eschews triumphalism and its verifications, not like proving something or holding certainty. Verification comes through the richness of one's life lived within the narrative, the tradition, symbolic space. And so one can't ultimately, if you're honest, adjudicate between forms of life from a distance, right? And that's like one of the problems of theology in a modern world, is you're adjudicating based on true false claims, as if you somehow, because we have access to parts of the world through science and can control it, and there's all these results, we have this kind of infatuation with that form of truth and what it means to possess it. And he's going, that's not really how religious traditions work. Kant had this line where he asked, how can knowledge be denied to make room for faith, right? And this was where, in the second critique, when Kant's getting to religion and ethics and these kinds of things, and Ricoeur kind of takes that and wants to go, in the fullness of faith, how can critical inquiry explicate the meaning of the presumptions and concerns generated by this faith, right? And so the as opposed to like, here's the critical thinking, here's the space in which you can do it. The making room for faith isn't making room for conclusions. If it's making room for faith, then it's making room for the fact that human beings are narrative creatures that exist in shared narrative communities, orient us one way. What's his name? John. Shoot.
I don't know.
I
don't know who you're thinking
most
of.
published philosopher of religion and alive.
Hick?
No, he's dead. Oh God, it's gonna irritate me.
Okay.
His name's John. He has a lot of really cool books, and it's really. But anyway, he had this whole bit on where he said that asking if it's true about a religious tradition or practice
Yeah.
prior to being formed by it is like asking someone to marry you and promise a life of love and fidelity on the first date. Love is something you must know the meaning of before you can say yes. And so when we think about the truth of religious traditions with this kind of epistemology of detachment, one that's great for science, right? That's not the kind of knowing, like, science of knowing and religious ones. It's one of involvement. Like, certain truths are only made manifest against a background of commitment and emotional involvement. And so he has this image that there's a double spiral of belief, the change of the one who sees, and then it changes what is seen, right? So like, by following Jesus, the disciples came to see Samaritans in a different light. You answer the question, who's my neighbor, in a different light. You go through all these kinds, all the way down to something like the least of these, right? That is an invitation to render the world through an interpretation that you only gain by giving yourself to the cross-dead Christ. And then you're like, no, he's the one who said the other is the face of the divine. Like, you meet Christ in, the Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, when she wrote this beautiful book on love's knowledge, and in it she talks about love being a porous form of knowledge. Porous form of knowledge, right? And so the knowledge you gain by it, right, like, is becoming porous to all that's happening within a tradition. But think of how the criticism of myth and literalism and these kind of things actually, in a sense, create a buffer between the main or the liberal Christian and the tradition, right? Think of what you said last week. Like, we're like, oh, it's important, but not essential or whatever. And then the congregation goes, well, it's not important and it's not essential, right? Underneath that is that sense of where the way we see, understand, and engage truth within this tradition is one where we're always in this buffered state between any of the claims, and we're the one adjudicating it. And what Ricord is saying, John Cottingham, that's his name, John Cottingham, are saying is like, no, that's not how religious traditions work.
Interesting.
Ricord had this line where he talks about the text isn't supposed to be read propositionally, but dispositionally, so that in the naming of God, we come into a new relationship with God, self, world, and other. So, like, in that sense, texts aren't deposits of truth, but faithfully inactive, they produce, or it generates a kind of a productive clash or fusion between the believer and the world. And which makes revelation, right, not something you possess or a proposition, but it's performative. It's enacted. And I think one of the things, both in, Wyman's like, oh, we should reclaim myth, is getting at that. Also, Gary Dorian had this line where he's talking about metaphysical courage, where he said that liberal theology needs to recover a willingness to make strong theological claims. And here's Dorian's line: Christian theology is inherently idealistic metaphysically and ethically, looking for God in all human feeling, knowing, willing, and being, above all in the struggles for justice and reconciliation. Right. And when he goes on, it's like, but then if talk of God gets put in the things we're buffering ourselves from, then what's left is just moral talk. And there are plenty of places for moral talk. Legitimation, or what justifies that moral talk, well, that's a separate conversation. But that sense of a metaphysical courage, but it's a metaphysical courage to get tied up in the way it orients and forms one life. It's not like metaphysical courage to get up there and be like, the Earth is 6,000 years old, and if you carbon date a mollusk, or whatever apologists might do to like try to undermine. The courage is this that kind of religious wager that Ricord was talking about.
Tripp, I know that a lot of our audience and conversation partners here have a theological education. Let me just say this in case somebody doesn't know this, because I find it so helpful, and you know so much more about this than I do, but I'll just do an introductory thing. So the entire field, you talked about the three roles. One was phenomenologist. The entire field of phenomenology, and correct me if I'm wrong, goes back to Immanuel Kant.
Husserl.
What's that?
I think a lot of people would say Husserl was like the OG.
Okay.
like where it's like a distinct thing.
Okay. And that Kantian dualism between the noumenal and the phenomenological is between that reality that's sort of beyond us and how it expresses or manifests in a phenomenon, right? Is that an okay introductory?
Kant's distinction of the phenomenal world and the noumenal is like, he's thinking through like how do we know? How do we think about how reason works? How and what are the limits of reason, and what is it we have access to, right? And so,
and we don't have access to the noumenal,
right? The phenomenologists are like, let us start with experience itself. Let's not bifurcate it or start with our reasoned reflections, like in a sense of the world as rendered with our best interpretation. Let's start with the datum of us experiencing, and let's attend to the phenomena, right? And so the bracket, as opposed to bracketing off the phenomenal from the noumenal in Kant, it is let us tend to what gives itself and start there, right? And so Husserl starts there. Then you get Heidegger. Then you get like, which was the second big phenomenological reduction. Then you get like the third one, people like Jean-Luc Marion, that kind of tradition. And there's a whole process phenomenological tradition. Like there's a minority reading of Whitehead as a phenomenologist. It's thoroughly fascinating. I had never really got into it till relatively recently. I was like, oh, interesting. This is a lot of fun.
I just have a couple friends who I know listen to the podcast and may not be as familiar with phenomenology and that task in the three that you named. So I just thought I'd spend a minute on that.
Yeah, but here's one of the reasons I think that's important, right? Think of how many people who don't think about their own experience, then think the legitimacy of their experience is tied to having certain true beliefs. And now they read the wrong Bart Ehrman book and are like, I guess I got to deconstruct the whole thing. Is any of it true? Right. And all of a sudden they read a book and learned something.
Yeah.
And now they are dismissing their own experiences with the love of God.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so I've talked to so many evangelicals, right? They're sitting there. And this is what's fascinating. Here's an example. Not too long ago, I was talking to a guy who grew up very, very conservative, reformed, like in his family were like church planners, part of church planners. It's not like lay people, but we're like, oh, we're planning these like Acts 29 type stuff. And he's, there's a lot of baggage there. Anyway, but he was like, well, he's like telling me stuff I know, right? Like about the Bible or whatever. And he's like, after that, I'm like, I don't even know what to make sense of any of this. Right. And then all these people that were a part of our church and stuff, they like get all worked up over Trump. And now I'm sitting there going like, what the hell? Like, don't you remember what you told me? And don't you remember like what love looked like? And we're trying to demonstrate our election by our commitment to our community and justice and, saying all these kinds of things. And like, I just I don't know what to believe or blah, blah, blah. And underneath it was, I asked a question. I was like, so like, well, why are you so disappointed in what they did? Right. And his answer is, because I experienced the love of Christ and have read the Bible, like, and this matters to me. And we were committed to this. And I was like, yeah. So even though you don't know if you can be a Christian or your place in this, you're judging them by an actual encounter with the divine love and taking seriously the teachings of Jesus. And I think you should lean into that, right? So if you think those experiences can only have veracity if your interpretation of them at a given moment and the community that facilitated it legitimate them, then I think you're missing the point. Because from God's perspective, God is the one who creates, loves in freedom, and desires to be known, encountered, and to embrace us in our finitude and brokenness. And you have experience of that where you go, y'all aren't living up to it. So you have more confidence in your own narrative about the love of God that was revealed in Jesus the Christ than you're aware of, right? And what about their humanity? especially you're like literally have a whole doctrine about how shitty humans are. You can't tell me we're totally depraved and then get upset that we act like it. Right. And so what they're falsifying shouldn't be the very experiences encounter with Christ that makes them seem abhorrent to you. You know, and what makes you suspicious of trusting an encounter with love, that when people that bear the name of Christ don't love their neighbor, you're like, why? And I bet it's because you actually have learned to see the face of Christ in your neighbor. And when they talk about immigrants that way, or your trans kid's friend, that you go, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Right. But you see, like, once that phenomenological question, like the datum of his own experience encounter with Christ is legitimated, right, by some theological certainty, now it no longer has a space. And I was like, why not? And it was funny. And he sends me a text a few days later, and he was like, that is weird, right? Like, they basically convinced me that if my encounter with Jesus led me to ever disagree with him, then I just never had one. I was like, yeah. Did you pick up any of did Jesus relate to any of his disciples that way?
Yeah.
You know, and he was like, no.
So you asked me early on how I was feeling about the future of liberal Christianity and our conversation last week. And let me tell you why I'm feeling a little more hopeful.
Is this you, or is this imaginary character you thought you might? Okay.
So this is me. Okay. I haven't fleshed out the character yet. I will work on it. I will.
Could you do the whole podcast? Did you do a whole podcast with an accent for your character? Monty Python French.
Try, especially if it was the Bears super fans. We're coming full circle here. Let me tell you why I'm feeling a little optimistic, and only a little bit, but it's there. So the mention of Bart Ehrman got me thinking. Everyone I've ever met who tells me something they read in Bart Ehrman, they're feeling pretty suspicious and discouraged about the tradition or what they were taught about the Bible or whatever, right? But a thing that happens, it doesn't always get named, but another thing that happens is when you take that interpretive or hermeneutical lens, and then you say not just about the text of Scripture, but the systematic theologies that the people who taught you about the Bible, the systematic theologies behind it, you also begin to suspect or be cynical about the systematic theologies, right? And the communities that hold them dear. And one of the things I find is that when evangelicals use the term deconstruction, they really mean destruction. They're not using deconstruction in the sense that Derrida and for us Caputo used it. They're using it in a demolition, not a deconstruction, right? When they say deconstruction, they mean how I lost my faith, right? And that makes me sad because true deconstruction in the academic sense has within it seeds of hope because it's based in love. It's because you love the text or love the community or the concept or the experience enough to not let it be solidified, concretized, codified to the point that it is rigid, but to make sure that it stays pliable and flexible and that it has life in it to interact. So it bugs me in the Bart Ehrman sense and many evangelicals that they say deconstruction, but they mean demolition or destruction. What for me, and this is why Paul Ricoeur means so much to me in the second naivete, the surplus of meaning, the reason those concepts draw goodness and life and love out of me is because it brings me to a point, and I think this is what I've been hearing you talk about for the last 15 minutes, is a constructive approach. So instead of us systematizing, right, which can be very lifeless and rigid into its categorical limitations, a constructive approach could take this this approach of phenomenology to start with what do we have and build up from there in love, right, which is this porous that you mentioned, porous knowledge. It's a give and take, and that then ties into the correlation, the correspondence approach that we talked about with people like David Tracy and Don Browning. So as I sort of round the corner here, I guess the reason I'm feeling a little more hopeful after this conversation is that a constructive approach has a heart of phenomenology to bracket and begin with. What do we have? It interacts with it in a, if you want to call it dialogical or correspondent way, correlative, in order for that porous knowledge to have a give and take that allows us to build from there and not dismiss our experience or grow cynical and bitter against those who taught us how to read the Bible or the systematic theology by saying, do I agree or disagree? Are they right or wrong? But to be in that porous place of knowledge that love can birth in a constructive sense, a life-giving path forward. So that's why I find myself a little more hopeful.
That's what I'm talking about. I like your hopefulness. Your hopefulness.
Don't get used to it. It's fleeting.
Wow. The one of the lines that I'd pulled out, it kind of connects with that, and I think there's a different way of renewing one's engagement with the tradition, right, on those terms. Gary Dorian has this line where he says, like, liberal theology's future vitality may depend on overcoming a perceived hesitancy or lack of clarity in articulating strong convictions about God. This doesn't necessarily mean a return to rigid dogmatism, but rather a renewed engagement with fundamental theological questions. And I think one of those shifts of kind of tending to the questions is important, which tending to questions is very different than tending to answers, right?
Let's hold on. That's a great line.
Well, good. I liked it. The which when Phil Clayton and I taught systematic, like that was like our whole framing device is like, the Christian tradition, here's the questions we ask, but like how you ask them and how you answer them as a part, one of the things of a living tradition is like you're inheriting it, but you're inheriting dignities and disasters. And so how do you ask this question again in your generation? How do you articulate it and answer it again? But what we hand on is a good question, because if you're handing on answers, they have a shelf life that's very different than a question. And I think that's,
wow.
I mean, I think that's really hopeful. There's this line passage at the beginning of Martin Buber's I Thou, where he's talking about what it means to be part of a living tradition. And he goes, everyone shows up at some point in it. You have all these things that are flooding into what it means, your identity, right, as a Jewish person of the people of Israel, right, as he's Jewish. And yet, like, too often we forget that all of the tradition only exists because the next generation picks it up. And the natality of a tradition is ever present. Like, its newness is always sitting there, right? And our tendency, when kind of repetitious inheritance has led to rigid diminishing energy within it is to go like, oh, it's dying and blah 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 blah, and he begins like this powerful book. Almost everyone's at least pretends they've read it, I Thou, by going like, no, like the whole thing's always being born again. Like that's what the tradition's doing. You hold it, right? Like that's what for circumcision and all these like we have baptism. Like there are all these rituals where the church is always being born again. The Jewish people are always being born again. And
wow.
And he's like, there's a kind of that the dying and birthing has within it a seed of hope that when you're in the particular cycle of your own embodiment in your own generation, your own instantiation of it, you over associate the present expression and its horizon with the vitality of the tradition and its potential.
Wow.
And I'm just like, oh, that. Come on, Boober. That whole book is a banger.
Listen,
I'm just saying.
I was just going to say, there's a fantastic example in that book, I Thou, about the King James Bible and the choice to utilize in the English translation for God the thou language. It was actually intended to make God, it was an intimacy. Yeah. There was a familiarity. There was an interpretive, a theological conviction. Then over time, because what I think Caputo would call the event of the name of God, humans, they migrated, right? That evolved, and then the thou became the monarch in the sky again. So it was actually, as the generational shift happened, the theological evolution actually reverted away from the intended move to make God close, intimate, knowable, in relational. And then it migrated back to now when American Christians read in the King James, it is the opposite effect, right? So that's how things migrate. It's because they are living traditions.
Yeah. And actually, like, I mean, Jeremiah's question, like, who are you to decide what the Christian religion is? Put it in chat. We literally watched someone get elected Pope yesterday, right? And like the tradition, it wasn't like Jesus was like, here's a Pope, and we invented it. It is a historical product of circumstance. And sometimes there were 3 of them. And yet, that there's a Pope is pointing out like the tradition's always being interpreted. Like, and it has whole structures for it. And also Jesus was like, you're going to do greater things than me. And like Jesus wasn't Christian. He was Jewish. So like they're all like it's just one of these things that even when you look at the Hebrew scriptures, like this is actually a debate between Jacob Talbus and Martin Buber about like what is more Jewish, right? The Torah or the apocalyptic literature. And underneath that is like, what is it? Like, is there original perfect instantiation and then all fidelity is based on orienting towards it? Or is the eruption of the new within the tradition gets more fertile and faithful element? Now, Christians, and this is Jacob Talbot's part, is like, that's why Paul's like really Jewish, because anyway, I don't want to side detour into Jacob Talbot's funny exegesis, but the sometimes the myth of a final abstraction of like the essence of a religion being a set of beliefs or a particular form or whatever is just kind of it sets people up to be disappointed that it's alive, And
can I just say that Pope, the election yesterday, as a social constructivist, authority also socially constructed. It was by their participation in the agreed upon system that gave them the authority to elect the new Pope. That authority is socially constructed. It's an emergent reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to say authority because I don't know where this guy in the chat's coming from, but I'm pretty sure he's one of these online apologists for orthodoxy.
Oh, well, look, it happens.
It happens too
But
much.
I mean, it's really like if you grow up and you're like a fundamentalist, but then you
Yeah.
read a Bart Ehrman book, then you're like, well,
Yep.
what's the best way of like keeping the same authority structure? Let me get the time. Let me get
Right.
maybe
Right.
the only real way to read any of it's with the church fathers.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, years later, you're coming up with ways of updating Neoplatonist metaphysics so that it includes evolution and a
Yeah.
13.8 billion year cosmic. And did you? This is a small aside, but I read this article the other day of people doing the sequencing of the universe based on like new data from the James Webb Telescope.
Oh my.
And it might actually be closer to 20 billion years old, our particular space time. Like
Okay.
I'm just saying, like, that's wild. Like, got a better telescope, get more data, and you're like, actually, that's a bigger jump than when we first realized that, it was probably more of like 100,000 years old. Like the number of times the
Okay.
story's gotten bigger through church history.
Interesting.
That could be a potential extra 7 billion years. Yeah. Woo.
Well, going back to the person who reads Bart Ehrman and then doesn't believe what they used to believe anymore, but doesn't know what I like to quote Saint Brian of McLaren in matters like this, that the beauty and the art is not just to believe different things, but to believe them differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where, for me, the hope comes from, is that I don't just believe different things than I used to, but I hold them differently. I source them, right, from a different constellation and configuration of location of revelation. We call them loci, in the academic world. That by having a different constellation of resources, I can not only believe something differently, I can believe it in a different way than I used to. More open-handed, more open-hearted, more open-minded.
Mm-hmm. All right. Can I just tell you the last few things I was thinking, but I'll just say them because some of it I want to pick up next time. I already had an idea of something else I want to talk to you about. Okay. But this is, Catherine Keller has this zinger of a quote, and she's been talking about the task of theologians and what theology is, right? Doing her theopoetic stuff and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And when she's talking about the urgent task of contemporary constructive theologians, in many ways, she's talking about embracing post-colonial possibilities, right? Looking at, right, where has the imagination within the church been cut off historically of late? It's the way it was trapped. And here's the quote: theologians should break free of theology's colonizing past, reinvent theology for new audiences, and embrace the post-colonial situation in which theology finds itself. And then after this, she's talking about places theologians should name the enactment of God in these different movements of liberation, like ecological movement, the feminist movement, different forms of liberationist movement, anti-globalist activists, these kinds of things. Part of what the church has done, right, has narrowed its vision so that it could play the function it played for a colonizing trajectory of the West. And it's like part of reinventing it for new audiences in a extremely diverse time is actually narrating how from one's faith you see the enactment of divine existing already in these other places, right? So it's like a God spotting activity of sorts. And then but then, like, for the tradition itself, it's like, how do you re-articulate it, aware of how you moved from Jesus the cross bearer to chaplains to cross builders, right? Like how when you see the way sin has been solidified into structures of power with the church functioning as its ally, how do you re-articulate it critically within the tradition? But then how do you also name the work of the Spirit outside of it in places where the very heartbeat of the one revealed in the Christ is active? Right? Think about ecological awareness and these kinds of things. And in the yes, I mean, I like all that, but the thing that stuck out to me is how so much mainline religion was formed when it had pride of cultural place.
Yeah.
That it needed to be the owner of whatever was good going on. And this is much more of a collaborative one, an enhancing one, a partnering one. Not surprising that a processed person might say that, but I do actually find that to be like something rather pragmatic, even if we think of co-passion projects at your church that we've talked about before, right? It's like, no, like we don't have to be the center of everything good and holy. We actually can be an ally because they have their own narrative for why they're doing it, but from ours, like we're joining what God's up to by participating in this. Anyway,
I love this exercise, and I love that you rounded the corner, because what I was thinking is, if I were to ask, I get to hang out with my buddies next week from all over the country, and they're in different ministry contexts and different theological places, and I love comparing notes with them. If I were to ask them to do this exercise with me, to name where we see the divine at work, where we see God, right, active in culture right now, I think the task is much more difficult than it used to be when Christ was on on the building, right on the outside, and you would say, there, God's at work there, right? When God's name is on the outside of the building, it might be easier to name, like, oh, I assume God's at work in there, right? But as we are in a decline narrative and cultural chaos and a conservative backlash and so many things that are going on in our culture, right? It might be more difficult to name communities and places where we see the divine at work. And because it's more dissipated, it's diluted, and it's much more collaborative than institutional.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yep. The Jeremiah is really upset in the chat.
I don't know.
I don't remember crying about freedom of speech for 5 years.
I don't know what's happening.
We took his freedom of speech.
I don't know.
And we're hypocrites. So it's good to find that out.
Police.
Yeah. I have not cried about freedom of speech. Just so you know, I do think it's really cool. I would be really sad to watch it go.
Yeah, it'd be a loss.
But I haven't cried about it yet, let alone for 5 years.
So funny.
But there we go. I forgot about my tears in the past. The one of the things. So there are two bits that I think would be fun to talk about later. One is what mainline communities could learn both from the Black church and Jewish communities in the way they both blend. Like you're more likely to see yourself as part of the community even if you are not as confident about particular convictions, and they have they center more of one's religious identity within the home and family. There's they function as more alternative cultures rather than desiring to be the center of culture. There's all these kinds of things, and it showed up. I thought about it when I was reading this history of the Black social gospel movement, and then in reference to Buber and such. Is it David Roberts? Anyway, one of the Black social gospelers he said that Black churches hold a balance of evangelical piety in the social gospel where there's both where the church embodies both a model of spiritual death and social engagement, and as not oppositional forces but reciprocal ones.
Wow.
And then thinking of kind of Jewish identity and the way that has functioned. I mean, I have very Jewish friends who practice the faith and aren't sure that God exists, but they don't feel alienated from the community. Right.
Okay.
And so it makes space for a kind of
Yeah.
embodied faith while your intellectual questions are in
Wow.
doubt, in ways that, even though I would think that's what I was describing in a mainline church, that's not often how it was experienced. So,
Tripp, listen, I'm loving this. Is just a beautiful conversation. I mean, because what you're talking about, instead of that cultural ascendancy, right, of the institutional and the cooperation, right, with cultural dominance, is a minority expression. What I keep circling back to is that love, right, is a porous knowledge, and this correspondence, this correlation of asking questions, and the beauty of listening for the answers, that there's a hermeneutics not only of suspicion but of understanding, right? Like the way that these pieces are coming together, actually, like in this constructive approach, it seems like the theological task of our cultural moment is to both account for that which has come before us and attend to that which is happening now through this lens of interpretation, but to hold it right in love as a porous knowledge. Like that's just a beautiful invitation.
yeah. Okay. So here's something I was thinking of that might be a fun next conversation, but you can veto it.
All right. Thanks.
Well, if it's not interesting to you, but then it would just be Tripp being excited. But I was thinking of Andreas Reckwig, who's a German sociologist. I recently read 2 of his books, and I found them wonderfully helpful, and it kind of articulating the cultural situation of modernity. And he divides modernity up into 3 sections, right, and points out that a lot of the institutional crises that we're having right now, those are the kind of like the playbook of sorts of responses for these institutions is one that they cultivated in kind of the second period, like industrialization and modernity in that period, and it doesn't have a match in the present, right? And so he spends all this time as a sociologist kind of describing late modernity and our kind of contemporary one, where there are all these sorts of cultural shifts, and is describing like where this increased focus on political identity and the phenomena of kind of polarization and tribalism in Western culture kind of emerge, and then how that's kind of reworked the kind of buckets of identity that you see showing up. And
Okay.
I found it so helpful because he talks about these kind of like 2 different trajectories of culturalization in late modernity that set up this kind of ongoing conflict that's playing out within political, economic, religious, all these different kind of social, cultural spaces. And so I thought I would try to come up with a way of presenting it to you next week.
Oh.
And then you tell me what you think.
It'll be 2 weeks. In 2
weeks. Oh, yeah, because we're doing our game next week. Or the next time
I
we do
still
it,
need to write that post.
We're doing it. Yeah, you got to send that before you go hiking. You're going canoeing. But after that, we'll play our game, then do this. Because I'm you know how like when you find a thinker, you find them compelling, and then you just read a bunch of their books, and then you're like, yeah, this is what I'm talking. This is what I was thinking. That's how I'm having right now. So I need I need the kind of a critical distance from it.
All right. Hey, I also like for a future episode, Ian Diorio here says, can you speak to why a theological project at all post Darwin? I'm thinking of the work of the philosopher Richard Rorty. I think it would be fun to talk about the masters of suspicion, right? Freud,
Okay.
Darwin, Nietzsche, and I always add Feuerbach. For me, that's the Mount Rushmore of the masters of suspicion. And why do theology at all? Why do we even need a theological project after the masters of suspicion? That would be a fun topic.
Yeah. I'm just avoiding starting right now.
Round two.
I have this I do this lecture when I taught philosophy of religion at the University of Edinburgh on the masters of suspicion. But for Ricoeur is Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and then I add Darwin precisely for this. Because that was because Darwin has one challenge, but it was after DNA that Darwinism became, I think, a more significant challenge, and it makes it more problematic. Though the neo-Darwinian synthesis has kind of collapsed, and now you have multi-level selection and all these other kinds of things now, so it kind of opens it back up, which was like the point in Back to Darwin, the book. It's a big edited volume from a conference at Claremont, but John Cobb wrote basically a whole book within this book that he won the kind of biology, philosophy of biology big book award for.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't know why that was necessary to say right now, unless someone's just sitting there like, I'm going to go get Back to Darwin. You can actually just read his big chapters in it to get an idea of the whole thing.
Okay. By the way, is this the Jeff Pugh, the author, in our chat?
Mm-hmm.
All right. He says you got to go through the fiery brook.
Yeah. You don't want to go around it.
Or get held up on the other side of it.
Oh, see, I was about to do a version of the going on a bear hunt, gonna catch a pig. Can't go over it, can't go. You don't know that song?
No.
You know Baby Shark?
I do, baby.
Yeah, the same genre, same same time period where kids come home from preschool singing them junks.
Okay.
But yeah. Ooh, but you should tell everyone about your canoe trip. This is that you do every year.
Yeah. So annually we it was a Feuerbach reference. I apologize. I did not catch that. Yep. Every year we do a week-long canoe trip and we move it around. But this year we are going back to the original route in the Adirondack Mountains.
And who's the we?
I have these canoe buddies. They're activists, like community organizers, pastors, friends. Some of them are in the corporate world. We do it every year. We love it. We fish, we camp. It's a 50-mile journey through the canoe-only waters of the Adirondacks.
Oh.
It's going to be wonderful. We sit around the fire at night and talk about deep things, and we're silly. And it's so life-giving and renewing for me. I look forward to it every year. It's the first thing that goes on my calendar. I build the rest of my year around it.
And are you like ready to discover like how much more it hurts after the third day this time? Like,
I'm much
certain
older.
Things that the older you get, you're like, oh.
I am much older and creakier than I was 4 years ago when we did this route.
How many years do you think y'all are glamping?
Glamping. Oh my gosh. It's soon. We tried glamping in Yosemite one year. It was not for us.
When Alicia and I first got married, I like finally talked her into going camping.
Yeah.
Because bye.
Okay, bye.
I would you take like high schoolers, and when I was campus minister, college students, we do like sections of the AT.
Yeah.
This kind of thing.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, this would be cool. Well, we're gonna go. We got camping gear for 2 now, and but before she even went to bed, she's like, "Yeah, I think you're gonna need to take me home. I don't like this." And I was like, "All right." And then we show back up in the morning when everyone else is getting up, and you're like not crickety at all. You didn't sleep on the ground. You went to a bed. Show up with a big bag of Bojangles and coffee. And they're like, oh. So, yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm glad that we had this, and that I will be able to think about this in my travels and sitting around the fire and fishing, instead of that conversation we had last week where I was
depressed.
A little discouraged. No, this will be good, and I'll look forward. We got some good topics coming up.
Yeah, and then we'll see if we remember them. That'd be the other part. That'd be the other.
Everybody, get your tickets to Theology Beer Camp.
Oh God, look at that! I completely forgot to say something like that. I even have this, our little ticker here. The early bird tickets go until May 15th, so you want to go to Theology Beer Camp and grab it.
Yeah.
Jeff is in the chat. One of the sessions in the Theology Nerd stage, we're having a big Bonhoeffer session, and with Jeff Pugh, who did the Rise of Bonhoeffer series with me. Lori Brandt Hale is going to be there. Vice President of the Bonhoeffer Society. Reggie Williams is going to be there. So we're going to have ourselves a good old Bonhoeffer time. So there's already a whole nother lure right there. Like,
what if I sat in the audience and just yelled things like, "More like Wronghofer, am I right?"
Or just raise your hand and be like, "I absolutely love Metaxas's biography," just to trigger Jeff.
Well, I read a book on Bonhoeffer that said something different.
I was made by the VeggieTales guy.
All right, man. I gotta head to the bank and straighten out a problem.
No way. You're gonna go adult. All right. Thank you everyone for hanging out, and we'll see you in 2 weeks after Bo gets done